Wait a minute. Oh, hello. All right, well, welcome back to Monty's Python Show, and we've got a new code-along tutorial video for you. And this is the second in the series of videos we have about Python decorators. And in this video, we are going to be using a Python decorator to modify the functionality of a method. And we're going to do this in sort of a real-world file scenario. So what's in this tutorial? We're going to learn how to create a decorator that modifies a method. We're going to learn how to access the objects that are available to a method decorator. And then we're going to learn this using a working example. So here's the general outline of the project. You are given a number of files, and the files are in a zip file, which is included in the description below. So go ahead and download that and unzip that folder onto your drive. Make sure you keep all the files in the same directory. So there is a file in there called main.py, and it's a simple budgeting tool. What it does is it allows you to enter transactions like purchase transactions or income transactions, record the amount, a description, and the type, and it saves it into a text file. The program uses classes and methods that are defined in another file called transactor.py. And your task is to create code that will monitor transactions that happen when the user is using this program. Specifically, you're going to monitor for transactions that are in excess of $5,000 or transactions that include certain keywords. Any transaction that's above $5,000 or contains one of those keywords is going to get flagged. Now, if a transaction is flagged, the information will be written into a file called monitor.txt. All of the other functionality will remain the same for the existing code. So the user of this won't even notice that the transactions are being monitored and written into another file. Your code is going to be written into the file monitor.py, which is in your directory. Right now, it's just an empty Python file. We're not going to change any of the code or functionality in any other file other than we're going to import the decorator into transactor.py, and then we will have to decorate one of the methods. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the project, and hopefully by this point you should have unzipped all of the files into your own drive. And let's take a look at the files that you have available. So there are 4 files in the zip drive. There is the budget data, which is a text file, and that currently just contains one transaction, but that is the file to which every transaction that gets entered in the system will be saved. There's a main.py file. That is the main code that runs the program. There is a file called monitor.py, and that is just an empty Python file. That is where you're going to create your decorator function. And then there is a file called transactor.py, and that's a module that has classes and methods that make that run the code in the main.py file. And this is where we're going to identify one of the methods to modify in order to achieve our monitoring software. Okay, so at this point, let's go ahead and run through the main.py file so you can see what this program does. So I'm going to run the code that's in main.py, and then I'll show you over in the console what's happening. Okay, so I've run the main.py file, and you can see that we've got an input. It's asking to enter a menu choice. So we have different things we can do. We can add transaction, view transactions, we can calculate a balance, and we can save and exit. And so since we're going to be working with adding transactions and decorating that, let me demonstrate how that works. So I'm going to enter 1 here to add a transaction. And then it asks you to enter a transaction type. So I'm going to enter in, let's just say I enter in rent. And let's say that my rent is $980 for the transaction amount. And then it asks you for a type, income, or expense. So I'm going to type in expense. And then now that you've entered that information, it tells you that the transaction has been added successfully, and it goes back to the main menu. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and save and exit. And so you see it gave the message budget saved, exiting. Let's go ahead and take a look at what is in our budget data.txt file so we can see what was added. So you can see here there's 2 lines in there. There was the first line, which was paycheck for $4,900, and it says it's income. That was a transaction that was already in the file. And then the second line, you can see that is the transaction that we just entered, rent for $980, and that is an expense. Okay, so that is basically what the main.py function does. That's what the program does. And our task is to create code so that we can monitor transactions. And if a transaction is flagged, we want to also write that transaction into another file called monitor.txt. And so the challenge is to do that without changing any code in main and without changing any of the functionality of the code in transactor, except for we're going to need to import the decorator that we create, and then we're going to decorate one of the methods in this file. When the transaction gets flagged, all of the transaction data will get written into the monitor.txt file, as well as the main file budgetdata.txt. So the idea here is that the code has been decorated. It's not been changed in any way other than adding the decorator, and the user of this program wouldn't notice a difference. Let's go ahead, and the first thing we need to do is think about which method makes the most sense to decorate, because we want to make sure that the method we decorate has the information easily accessible into it that we want to monitor. So the information that we're monitoring is we're looking for transaction amounts above $5,000, and we're also looking for keywords in the transaction description that we want to try to identify. So if we look at the different methods available to us here, so let's take a look at the different methods in here. We have our constructor method first, and then right away we see a method here called add transaction, and we can see that one of the inputs to that is transaction. This transaction object that gets created as the program is running is going to be the object that has the information in it. And let's look right here and see what is actually inside of a transaction object. Well, it has three different things. It has a description, it has an amount, and it has a transaction type. So that's all the information that we're going to need. So it makes the most sense to decorate the add transaction method. It has all the data we're going to need for a particular transaction available in this transaction method. Okay, so since we've identified the method that we want to decorate, let's go ahead and start building up our closure and our decorator function. So first thing we need to do is define our decorator function name. I'm just going to call it transMonitor. So I'm going to define a function called trans_monitor. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and give the transMonitor function, I want to specify two parameters that will get passed to it. One is the threshold amount. So let's call that threshold. And I'm going to set a default value of threshold to $5,000. And then let's also create keywords that we want to flag. And let's create that as a list. So let's say flag, and let's set that equal to a default list containing the words political, jewelry, and Ukraine. Okay, and just need a colon at the end. So we've got two parameters for our decorator function. So when we decorate the method, we will make sure that we have parentheses. And if we want to override the default values for threshold and flagged terms, we can enter those there. But if we just enter the have parentheses with no arguments, the decorator function will use the default values that we've placed here. So that's our decorator function. Now we need the function that is going to stand in for the method that we're replacing. So a decorator, if you remember, if you watched the first video in the series, the decorator function basically stands in for the function or the method that you're decorating. And actually it will call that function or method in its own code. And the actual function that gets returned back that stands in for that function or method is the middle layer, which I'm going to call wrapper, like that. The wrapper function is going to have one argument, which is going to be the method. So if you remember in the last video, when you decorate a method or a function, among the items that get available, that get passed into the namespace of the function is the function or the method itself that you're decorating. So we're going to actually have access to the method that we're decorating here. And so the wrapper function will have that as the argument. Okay, then we're going to have our inner function. So I'm going to define inner, and our inner function is going to have 3 arguments to it. And these are things that are going to get passed into this when we decorate the function. One is the actual instance of the object that we're decorating. So I'm just going to call that instance. And this would be equivalent to using self when you're creating classes. But since we're not creating a class, we're creating a function, I'm not using the word self just to distinguish that this is different than creating a class. I'm using the word instance. The other 2 arguments we're going to have that we have access to when you decorate a method or function is any of the arguments that get passed when the method is invoked or called. So we have access to those variables, and the way we're going to unpack those and access those is using star args and double star quargs, just like that, colon. Okay, so that's our 3-layer closure that we're going to create. And so now we need to define what is the processing that we want to do on the inner layer. Okay, so for starters, I just want to print out and show you the value of args. Print args. So we're going to print the value of args. And then the other thing I want to do is I'm just going to actually call the method that we are decorating right here. So the way you call the method inside your decorator, using the name, just like calling a function method, and then we're going to pass the instance, and then this is where I'm going to pass any of the args or quargs that were passed to the initial call of this method when it's actually used in the file. Okay, and then let's go ahead and finish off our closure. I'm just going to give myself a little sorry. And I'm also just going to set a variable here. So I'm gonna when I call the method, I'm gonna set it equal to result, and then I'm gonna go ahead and return result. So my inner function, all it does is print the arguments, and then it invokes the method that we're decorating with the arguments that were already passed to it, saves that in result, and then returns it back to the wrapper function. Then here in inner, we need to return inner here. And then on our wrapper function, we're just going to return wrapper. Okay, so that's our decorator, and it's called trans monitor, and it's got 2 optional arguments. So let's go ahead and import this module, or at least that decorator, into our transactor.py. So from monitor import and trans monitor is what we called it, trans monitor. Okay, now I'm going to go down to the method that we are going to decorate, and I have to be careful not to mess up my indentation. And right above the method we're decorating, we're going to decorate it using @trans monitor, and I'm going to pass no arguments into the parentheses. And go ahead and save all your files. And so at this point, we're not actually going to be monitoring any transactions. We just want to see what comes back from printing the object. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run the main file, and let's go ahead and try to add a transaction. So I'm going to choose number 1 to add transaction, give it a description. I'm going to call it test, and I'm going to put in an amount of 999. And let's say that is transaction type expense, enter. Now, if you notice in my console, after I hit enter, right here, it printed out args. And so you can see, as usual, args is a tuple. So the arguments that get passed to a function or a method are always saved in a tuple. And there's only one thing in that tuple, and you can see that it's a transaction object. So our closure is working perfectly. It actually captured the transaction object, and we know if we have access to that transaction object, we have access to all of its attributes. And remember, its 3 attributes were the description of the transaction, the amount, and the type of the transaction type. So we can get all the information we need from this transaction object to monitor the transaction. In other words, do we need to flag it? And we also have the information that we're going to use to write to the monitor.txt file. All right, so let's go ahead and hit 4 to save and exit. And so now let's go back into our monitor.py. So we know this is working. It ran the other method just fine. Actually, let's just check our budget data text file real quick and make sure, yep, there's our transaction that we put in, test 999. So it worked perfectly. You wouldn't have even noticed the difference except for it printed out the object. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is, instead of printing args, let's give ourselves a little space here. Let's go ahead and set the variables that we need. So the amount, the description of the transaction, and the transaction type. And let's go ahead and set that equal to, now we know that args is the transaction object, or excuse me, args is a tuple that has the object in it, and the object is the first thing in that tuple. So let's index args to get access to that object. So args at index 0 is actually going to be the transaction object. Now I can get the attributes from that individually. So the amount I want set equal to dot amount. That's the amount attribute of the transaction object. And then my description is going to be args 0 dot description, I believe it was, and then args 0 dot transaction type, I think it was. Make this a little smaller. Let me just double check in transactor. Yeah, so we had description, amount, and transaction type. Those are our three attributes. So we're accessing the instance attributes that we need. We're saving them in amount, description, and type. Now all we have to do is write the logic of how we're going to monitor transactions. So it's just a simple if statement that will flag transactions, right? So here's how we're going to do it. If the amount AMT is greater than or equal to threshold, that will be one flag. So if the amount is greater than the threshold amount of 5,000, and so this would obviously flag both income and expense input types. So we could make it more complicated if we just wanted to look at one side or the other. But we're just doing the sort of the absolute value of 5,000. So any transaction 5,000 or more gets flagged. And then we have a second set of criteria, so we can use or. So either the threshold or a keyword argument should trigger a monitoring. And so then how are we going to monitor to see if any of our keywords are present in the description? Well, we're going to use the any function in Python. And if you don't have any experience with the any function or you haven't used it before, pause the video and go Google that. It is a very handy function to have for things like this, where we're looking for multiple items. And the description, of course, could be a string that has multiple words in it. And so this is a pretty easy way in one line to check to see if any of our keywords are going to be present in the description. And so here's how you use the any function. You just type in any, and then you write what looks very similar to like an inline for loop that you would use in a list comprehension inside of any, except we're going to write it as a Boolean statement that can be evaluated as true or false. And so in our case, we want to see if any of the words are in description, and then we're going to loop over every word in our variable called flag. So here's how we write it. So word in, and our description is called DESC. So word in description. So that's the Boolean statement. So that could be evaluated to be either true or false if the word was in description or not. But then how do we go through each of the words in our list? This is where we write the inline loop right here. So we say for word in flag. So flag is the iterable collection that has all the words in it that we're going to loop through. And that will set the iterator variable word each time to one of the words in flag. And then it will evaluate the Boolean statement that word is in description, or DESC, and that will evaluate either true or false. And so this will loop through any of them. And so the any function will flag if any of those things comes back as true. So if any of the words are in the description, the any function will find that and it will return a single true value. Now I just want to do one thing in the any function here to edit it to make it a little bit more foolproof, which is it's possible that the words that get typed into the description might have different cases. So let's unify the case that we're comparing. So let's take any word and make it lower, right? So that's any word in flag, and then let's also make the description lower, dot lower. So we're lowercasing the description to match. So that way, if we forget and we enter in one of our flags as an uppercase, it will make it lowercase, and it will also make the entire string that is the description lowercase. So then if a word is present, it will get flagged by our any function. And then we just need to put a colon at the end. Okay, so just for now, let's go ahead and print out a statement, item flagged, and then let's test our decorator to make sure it's working. So I'm going to print item flagged. Okay, and let's go ahead and save that. And then let's go back and run our main.py file. Let's see if this works. Okay, so we have our budget tracker menu here in the console. Let's go ahead and try to add a transaction that we would think would be flagged. So I'm going to enter one. So let's start off, let's run through all of our keywords. So I'm going to enter a transaction description to include, let's say I'm going to say new jewelry. I don't know. And let's say the transaction amount was $600, and the transaction type would be an expense. Okay, so notice it printed item flagged, so it had to be from jewelry because the amount is not above $5,000. So that did seem to flag that. Let's test for an amount above $5,000 and make sure that that also flags. So I'm going to add another transaction with a description of, let's just call it rent. Let's set it at $5,600 as an expense, and that also flagged. Now let's just do a regular transaction. Let's call it paycheck, and let's say it's $3,500, and that is income. And so that one did not get flagged because it did not print monitor transaction. So we're good to go. Let's go ahead and do 4 and save and exit. Okay, so we're looking good with our monitor. We just need to now add the code that will write the transaction data to the monitor.txt file. Okay, so let's go ahead here and add a little line of code here. So, oh, that needs to be, sorry, needs to be inside of our if statement. Okay, so we're going to use the open method here. So with open, and the name of our file is going to be monitor.txt. And then, so since we're only writing a single transaction at a time, we don't want to write, we don't want to use write mode. We would want to use append mode. So we're going to set that to A for the append method. And we'll just say as file. And then all we need to do is then file, use the write method to write the transaction string. So let's write the transaction string like this, a formatted string to include the description, which is in the variable DESC, comma, we'll do comma, no space, and then we'll do the amount, AMT, and comma, and then the type. So we're creating this just like the other file. It's a text file, but it's a comma separated file with no spaces. Okay, so that is our file write, and then we need to append a new line escape code on the end there, so that we get each time we append something, it adds a new line, and that looks good. And then the last thing we want to do is let's go ahead and remove the print statement because we don't want to change any of the functionality of the program. We just want it to monitor. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that print statement. Now let's test it out one last time. So I'm going to go over here and run the main file. Let's put in a transaction that's going to get flagged and see if it gets written to monitor.txt. So let's say that let's call the description Ukraine bribe. Make it really obvious. Transaction amount is $4,500, and that's an expense. And go ahead and run that. Okay, so it just said transaction added successfully. It didn't give us any message saying it was monitoring, but you may notice up in your file tree that it created a monitor.txt. So we know that something good happened. It at least created that text file. So let's go ahead and save and exit. And then let's look at the monitor.txt file. And there we see that we have the Ukraine bribe for $4,500 as an expense. So that's in our monitor file. Let's check to make sure that that transaction is also in budget data. So there it is. So if you were a user of this budgeting software, you wouldn't have even noticed that the transaction was being monitored and saved into another file. It seemed to be working just normally to you. But because we decorated that method, we actually sort of hijacked that method, and we created a function that stands in its place that calls it, so it does all the same things it normally does, but then it also monitored the information and wrote it to the monitor.txt file. All right, so that concludes this code along tutorial. Hopefully that was helpful and helps you understand how to write closures and use them to decorate methods and or functions. And hopefully this sort of semi-real world example makes that a little bit clearer for you. All right, until next time, keep the crumbs out your beard and Python.